Welcome to my US history lecture, or welcome back to my US history lecture. Today we're going to be talking about the early Cold War, basically how it started and some of the early confrontations that we see. Before we get into that, let's start by talking about the United Nations. So this was established in 1945, basically to replace the old League of Nations. All right, it's going to have its headquarters in New York City. And the main goal is, of course, peacekeeping, right? We don't want another world war like World War I or World War II, promoting human rights, natural rights, providing humanitarian aid in times of crisis, like a natural disaster or a famine or a global pandemic, and then also economic security. All right. The structure of the UN is like this. There's the General Assembly. Each member nation has a representative. It started with 51 countries. Now it has 193, right? So this is the General Assembly, okay, where they all meet and they can talk about stuff and vote on things. And then a special feature of the new United Nations that makes it different from the League of Nations is this, the Security Council. It has 5 permanent members and then 10 rotating members that are elected on a 2-year term. And if you are on the Security Council, you have veto power, right? The 5 permanent members were basically the winners of World War II: China, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and the US. All right. And again, there are 10 rotating members as well. There's all these other things that the UN does. They have all these councils and like International Criminal Court and stuff like that. They have all these agencies as well, like the World Bank and the IMF, the World Health Organization, which we've been hearing a lot about lately. Food and agriculture organizations, the UNICEF, UN Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization that kind of promote all these goals. One important thing that I want to point out is in 1947, the UN did help support the creation of this new country, Israel, which would be a state for Jewish people, mostly European Jews, who of course have just gone through the Holocaust. And I mention this because this is definitely going to cause some conflicts for the US, our support and the UN support of Israel, because the big problem with Israel is that there was already a country there and that there were already people living there. And that's why we see a big conflict. All right. Now let's get into the actual Cold War, right? So we can define the Cold War as this state of political hostility that existed between the Soviet bloc countries, right? The Soviet Union, all their satellite nations and allies, some of the other communist countries here like China and Cuba, and then all of the US led powers from about 1945 to 1990, right? So we have the US and all of our other countries there. Now, of course, this is a Cold War because we never actually fought the Soviets, right? It was characterized by, instead of actual fighting, instead of actual war, threats, propaganda, spying, right, between the two superpowers. We do see the US and the Soviets and the Chinese engage in proxy wars where we're fighting through other actors. So we'll see this, for example, in Vietnam and Korea, all right? And basically, both superpowers have competing visions for what we want the post World War II world to look like, right? The Soviets have this communist economy, this authoritarian government. The Americans promote capitalism and democracy, right? And so we really start to see this here in the years following World War II, right? The Soviet Union starts to kind of come in and occupy and annex a lot of these countries here in Eastern Europe, and we start to get a little bit concerned, right? So during and after the war, the Soviet Union annexed many countries in Eastern Europe. They put forth this so-called Iron Curtain, right, that divided East and West. The Soviets, from their perspective, want to create this security buffer, right? They've been invaded twice in the past few decades, so they want to make sure that doesn't happen again. The US sees this as them trying to expand and create an empire and spread communism, right? So we are going to adopt this policy of containment. And this is the most important thing to understand about the Cold War, because everything we do for the next like 40 years is going to be for containment, right? And this is preventing the further spread of communism in the world by limiting it to where it is. We don't want to necessarily go in and destroy it, right? We don't want to invade the Soviet Union and take over. We just want to contain it, not let it spread. And this becomes our very, very top foreign policy priority during the Cold War, right? President Truman announced that the U.S. would aid anyone fighting communist aggression, right? This becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. We first see this here in Turkey and Greece, which were coming under pressure from the Soviet Union. So we sent over supplies and ships and planes and all this stuff to help the Turkish government and the Greek government fight off Soviet aggression, right? So that they don't fall to communism too, like some of their neighboring countries had, all right? And this is an example of what we see throughout the Cold War. The US is going to intervene in various countries, in various situations, and at varying levels to support non-communist governments, all right? Another good example of how we start to see containment in action is the Marshall Plan. In 1947, Congress created the Marshall Plan led by Secretary of State George Marshall. This is a plan to rebuild Western Europe. The US provided over $12 billion in aid to all of these Western European countries here, right, to help them rebuild. But it's also a way to promote American influence and prevent the spread of communism, right? Because if we're here supporting these countries, giving them lots of money, right, the Soviets aren't, and they're more likely to be our ally and to be capitalist and democratic and not communist, right? Another way we see this here in 1948 is the formation of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All right, and so we're going to join with several Western European countries here, like the UK and France, were some of the original member nations to form NATO, which is essentially a military alliance. This is a big deal for us because we've never been in a military alliance before. We've typically avoided that. That's why we didn't join the League of Nations. The main tenet of NATO is that an attack on one is an attack on all, right? And it was basically a way to get militarily prepared to contain communism, right? The Soviets responded by forming their own military alliance called the Warsaw Pact. So you can see, started out with UK, France, Italy, the US, Canada, and it grew over the years to include countries like Turkey and Greece, right? And now includes a bunch of these countries, right? And still is kind of fighting off aggression from Russia over there, all right? We also see containment and action in Asia as well, right? The U.S. is going to oversee the demilitarization of Japan after World War II and help create a new democratic government. You can see Douglas MacArthur here, General MacArthur is going to oversee this, and he's actually going to help write the Constitution and oversee the very first democratic elections in Japan. And we provided extensive support to help rebuild Japan and build very strong economic and political ties, which we still enjoy to this day. We also see the U.S. trying to contain communism in Korea. Both the Soviets and the Americans are going to oversee the demilitarization of Korea after the war. And we're going to see a weird situation because both the Soviets and the Americans are there. We're going to end up splitting the country here in half, basically, at the 38th parallel, right? We're going to have this communist government supported by China and the Soviets, led by Kim Il-sung in North Korea. And then we're going to have this democratic capitalist government led by, supported by the US, led by this guy, Syngman Rhee, all right? One of the problems we run into is this guy was not very popular, right? But we're still going to support him because he's not communist, all right? We're going to talk about how this situation kind of falls apart in a little bit when we get to the Korean War. Also, we see our attempts to control and contain communism in China, although this is not as successful, all right? Communists led by this guy, Mao Zedong, are going to lead a successful communist revolution in China in 1949. There was this decades-long Chinese Civil War, all right, and the communists are going to win, basically, And this is going to be a huge blow to containment, right? Because China is huge, it has a huge population, but now it's going to be communist. And then in 1950, they signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. All right. So again, that revolution was in 1949. Also, another bad thing happened in 1949. The Soviets got nuclear technology. All right. And this is going to kick off what we call the arms race, which is a signature part, a key part of the Cold War, right? Because the thing that made the Cold War so scary, especially in these early years, was this threat of nuclear war, right? Remember, we were the first to use nuclear weapons to end World War II, right? In 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb, right? This is about 3 years before our best scientists thought it was possible, right? So, how did they do it, right? Our first thought is spies, is espionage, right? They must have had spies here, they must have stolen these secrets, all right? And this is going to kick off what we call the arms race, which is basically this competition between the US and the Americans to build the most and the biggest and most powerful weapons. You can kind of see this here. We got the early jump on them, right? But then the Soviets will kind of catch up to us and outpace us a little bit here in terms of the number of nuclear warheads, all right? This arms race is about quantity and quality, right, of nuclear weapons and just about military power in general. So it's definitely about nuclear weapons, but it was also about, aircraft and tanks and all sorts of other, sonar and radar and all sorts of other technologies that we could compete with the Soviets, all right? Um, and this definitely included, like I said, nuclear weapons, including much bigger, more powerful ones like the hydrogen bomb. The US perfected this technology here in 1951. The Soviets followed a year later. This is a picture here of a hydrogen bomb test. It's about 400 to 500 times more powerful than a regular atomic bomb like the one we used in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. All right. So after 1949, further confrontations between the US and the Soviet Union is going to mean the threat of nuclear war. All right, guys, we're going to stop there. Again, this was the early Cold War.